The Native American Indians have an idea that they call the twin trails. The twin trails is the idea of the outer journey and the inner journey. And what they say is that you can't embark on the outer journey, your work, your life, without also embarking on the inner journey. How this relates to the economics of mutuality is that as we talk about pushing the boundaries of the firm, we also have to talk about pushing the boundaries of the mind. So I've been on a journey where I've been exploring, well, what does this mean for leadership? And we're starting to uncover what we call some leadership imperatives. And the first one that I'm going to talk to you about today is this idea of unlearning. So unlearning, if you look it up in the dictionary, is really about letting go of something. Letting go of some of our assumptions, some of our preconceptions, maybe some prior knowledge that may not apply any longer. Now that can be very easy if you're talking about changing how you use a keyboard, okay? So when I moved from the UK to France, I had to adjust from an English keyboard to a French keyboard. It was very awkward, but within a few weeks, it was amazing how my body had physically adapted and started getting used to the different places with different keys. However, when you're starting to talk about changing how you operate in the world and your worldview, that seems to be much, much harder. Few of us fully appreciate that the thing that underpins our competence in something are actually attitudes, values, beliefs, and assumptions. So if you have an assumption that conflict is bad, and bad things will happen if you get into conflict, it doesn't really matter how many conflict management courses you go on, this assumption will limit your ability to apply those skills. So when we talk about leadership, we start to think about how do we start to work with some of our underlying assumptions. So actually, unlearning is actually extremely difficult. This is a young researcher called Alice Stewart, who was researching in 1956. And she got very interested in the idea that when you looked at health indicators, not surprisingly, and it holds today, poorer communities tend to have poorer health indicators. But there was one exception, which was that the incidence of childhood cancer seemed to be more prevalent in more affluent societies. And she wanted to explore why that was. And what she discovered was there was a link between childhood cancer and X-raying pregnant women. This was a revolutionary discovery. She researched it, proved it categorically. And yet, it was 25 years after that research that the BMA banned the X-raying of pregnant women. So that's really amazing, isn't it? That even when presented with categorical facts, we are unable to see or change our behavior. So why is this? You've probably all heard of something called confirmation bias. The way our brain works is that we have a view about something. And even when someone tells us something is different, even when someone presents us with data that suggests it might be different, we tend to dismiss it. This is a challenge we have as human beings that we have to work with. So can you work with it? How does this apply to economics and mutuality? So when we're thinking about changing how business works, it may require us to change some of our underlying assumptions about that world. So in a number of interviews that I conducted in 2014 and 2015, I spoke to a number of business leaders about this idea of a more mutual business. And what I discovered was I got a very consistent answer. The answer I call is the yes, but answer. You may have heard it. Yes, that's a great idea, because guess what? Most of us as leaders can connect with the aspirational idea of becoming more mutual. Yeah? We can see what's going on around us, and we would like it to change. But sometimes our assumptions we hold get in the way of us reimagining that future. And so the answer goes, yes, but business performance comes first. Yes, but if we make enough operating margin, then we can invest in nice things like mutuality. So what we're being invited to do is to shift some of those assumptions that we hold, that we've held for 50 years. Assumptions around competition, assumptions around the purpose of business, assumptions around the role of money. Those are the things we need to open the door and consider there might be a different truth. So how do we do that? Who can do it? This is a guy called Christian Picciolini. Christian Picciolini spent 8 years as part of a neo-Nazi movement in the US between the age of 14 and 22. He was committed to that movement. And yet now, and you can see him on a TED Talk telling his story, you'll discover him talking to young people about how to avoid radicalization. He talks about how he got into it, but he also talks about how he got out. So here's quite an extreme case, an extreme worldview, and yet something happened that changed him. What seems to have happened was the first thing was that he became a husband and a father. And he struggled with the idea that his identity as a neo-Nazi, an identity that was associated with extreme violence, didn't quite fit with the identity of a loving husband and a loving father. And yet even that wasn't quite enough, because actually he lost his marriage. The thing that then actually shifted him was he had a number of interesting disconfirming experiences. He bumped into an African American in a shop. They got into conversation. And this gentleman shared with him that he was having a really bad day because his mother had just been diagnosed with breast cancer. Now, this was an experience that Christian could relate to. And so in that moment, he considered that he had something in common with the other, with this other person, this person who was the subject of his hate. So a number of experiences like that, presenting some very disconfirming data to him, was enough for him to look at himself and say, I need to change. So quite an extreme example. And yet, if Christian can change his outlook and his worldview, then maybe there's some hope for us. So how do we help leaders to do this? You'll see a quote on the right by a friend of mine from the Centre of Creative Leadership, where he says, actually, in general, what happens is that it's very hard for us to change our worldview unless something from the outside of us comes in and disrupts our experience enough that we might open our minds to a different possibility. How this happens typically is that some unexpected life event might happen to us. We might lose a friend or a family member. We might get divorced. We might get fired. We might not get the job we hoped we'd get. But there's something that happens that changes and gives us different data to maybe the story we're holding about ourselves or about someone else. Now, I can't develop leaders through unfortunate and unexpected events. But what I can do is think about how do we create the conditions for leaders whereby we might create the sort of environment, the sort of experiences that will present them with different sets of data, just enough that they might become a little bit less certain about their worldview. So this is something we've started to experiment with. So in Mars, we've had a couple of experiences over recent years. The first is using a diagnostic framework to help leaders to surface the assumptions that they hold about the world. So what we did was took a group of senior Mars leaders and we worked with them on the idea of customer centricity, a very key theme for this business over the last 3 to 4 years. And we worked through the framework to say, what are the assumptions we hold about the customer, our retail customer? This is what we discovered. The customer is the enemy. If we give them an inch, we'll take a mile. No amount in negotiation training is going to shift your partnership with the customer if you have this assumption. Now, these assumptions are invisible to us. You can't blame anyone for them. We can't see them until we use techniques that help us to go, oh, wow, that's interesting. Now, when we went through this experience, what we discovered was that it wasn't enough. It was intellectually interesting. Everyone went, wow, that's amazing. And they walked out the room and nothing changed. I went, wow, okay, so what else can we do? What will make the difference? So we did something else. We took a group of leaders to Cincinnati, to a poor neighborhood in Cincinnati, mainly African American, a neighborhood that had suffered from years of crime, drug addiction, general economic hardship, race issues, and so on. And we spent a week with that community in dialogue about mutuality. What does mutuality look like here? What are your mutuality challenges in your environment? Now, that was intellectually interesting, but something else happened, because in that experience with people who were very, very different to us, we started to notice some surprising data. We started to notice that there was some amazing leadership in this community, coming from the bastion of business leadership. Surely we are the ones who stand up for great leadership. We train our leaders to be fantastic. And yet here in this small community, with people who've been through some very challenging experiences, with people who are having to lead when sometimes their lives are on the line, we started to see some really powerful leadership. Maybe we noticed that the idea that we could relate to people who are different to us was being shattered as we started to mix with people who really were different to us, and we started to struggle to relate to them. So you can see from those examples that in that experience, every leader is slightly different, but we started to get some personal experiences where we went, oh, hang on. What I thought was true may not be true. And what was different about this experience and walking out of it was I had no doubt that every leader in that room was going to walk out different and committed to this journey of mutuality. And the reason was that they felt more compelled to do something because they had had a more emotional experience and a felt experience of what was going on. And you've probably had experiences like that in your lives that have changed you. It is not enough for us to have an intellectual relationship with data and with ourselves. We have to go out and experience things and be changed by those experiences. So as a leader, the one invitation, which is echoing what Alistair said, if you really want to engage in this sort of journey, then you need to engage in that inner journey of how do I grow myself such that I can lead in this way. And that means you have to be willing to disrupt yourself. So my advice would be once a year when you're planning your annual holiday, you also plan your annual disruption. Not too much, just something that makes you slightly uncomfortable, but not overly uncomfortable. If I go and do that over there, how do I feel about that? Oh, a little bit nervous. That's going to be different. That's the sort of feeling you want to have. That's when you know you're onto something. So I'm going to leave you with a Mark Twain quote and a warning. Be very wary of certainty in yourself and in others. When someone speaks loudly with confidence, start to doubt. And especially with yourselves, because it starts with you. Think about your commitment to grow as a human being so that you can be part of this future we want to create. Think about what you can do and your responsibility to grow yourself. Thank you.